help increase those levels of accountability. When you start with a new team, you always want to document some sort of team charter. Who's used a team charter before? Is anybody? Yes, ooh, several. Oh, I should have known. I'm among friends. Yes. So we won't belabor this point. But again, the whole point is ensuring we're all on the same page in terms of our expectations. For those who haven't used them before, these are some of the items you might want to include. A team name, the team leader, member, sponsor, strategic alignment. Figure out how this team's role fits in with the overall strategy of the organization. What our mission, define the mission, define the objectives. That sounds really simple, but you'd be amazed. One of the little tricks I do sometimes is if we have a team of 8 people, I'll take each person out into the hallway and I'll ask them, what's the primary objective of this team? And if I have 8 people, how many different objectives do you think I get?
9.
Yes, sometimes 9, which is a little scary. But again, that's how you kind of end up combing spaghetti later because everybody's moving in a slightly different direction. You want to be really clear about that and you want to document it. Clarifying scope. In scope, out of scope. Now, scope is something that you will typically see on a charter, but usually they don't do both. Usually they just say define the scope. Why do you think I say in scope and out of scope? Why not just list what's in scope and then we know if it's not on there that it's out? Why not do it that way? More potential for scope creep, and why? Why do you think that's a little more dangerous? Why do you think I recommend listing what's out?
Because it's easier to identify immediately when it comes up.
Exactly. It's a lot more specific. So this way, if we said, hey, international, out of scope. Marketing, out of scope. Anything that deals with e-commerce, out of scope. So when those things come up, it's very easy to identify it and to shut it down. And we've already had that conversation up front. What also I tend to find is when you list what's in and what's out, invariably there's some percentage of the group that just assumed that, because we said we're doing vendor analysis, well, the RFPs go to the vendor, so I just assumed that was part of vendor analysis. So that out of scope list, it helps you refine what do we really mean by the items that we listed when we talk about in scope. Okay? I really have also found over time that clarifying what's out of scope really gives you more specificity in terms of what's really in scope. It shows you the boundaries, shows you what's out of the boundaries. When I was getting married about 4 years ago, I was interviewing wedding planners, and that's, I guess, the new thing. I don't know how anybody got married before. Everybody is a wedding planner now. And so I was interviewing these wedding planners, and I'm all excited, and I'm meeting them at coffee shops, and I've got my list of questions, and my first question was, tell me what you would do for me. What's your list of services? What can you do for me? Now, if I'm the bride, what do you think they said?
Everything.
Everything. Oh, my goodness, sweetie. Oh, you're so pretty. You're the bride. I just want you to sit there on a lily pad. You're not going to do a thing. Okay? Now, do you really think they did everything? No. I realized I was asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, what will you do, what's the better question?
What won't you do?
What won't you do? What is out of scope? And believe it or not, I started asking that question. They had a long list, okay? They were like, well, I'm not going to be addressing your invitations. I'm not going to be picking people up at the airport. I'm not going to be attending your shower. Long list of what they wouldn't do. And really what I found out was that was the better list. That really showed me where the boundaries were. So if you're not talking about what's in scope for the team and what's out of scope, have that conversation. I promise you, you have that conversation with your teams, you'll see there were some disconnects. There will be some things that are listed on out of scope that they thought were in scope and possibly vice versa. Very, very good conversation to have. Next thing, success metrics. You want to ask yourselves right up front, how will the team measure its success? Wouldn't it be nice to know that at the beginning instead of at the end? Have you ever had that sit down with your manager and you realize you weren't on the same page in terms of how you were being evaluated, but you didn't find out until the end? That's no fun. That's almost like signing up for a college class, but you don't get the syllabus until the final exam. So you really want to know how you're going to be measured. How are we defining success? How will we measure our success? Team member time commitments. We need to be crystal clear about what's expected in terms of being a member of this team or maybe even this project team. I mean, if I had $1 as a project manager for every time I heard somebody complain about the fact that they had a real job, okay? And this was something they were doing in addition to their real job. And they were just doing this part-time. And that's the danger phrase. Because if I throw that out there and I say, hey, I'm going to need you part-time, what could that mean? What could part-time mean?
1 hour a week.
Could be 1 hour a week.
I pick and choose what I want to do.
Exactly. We got to pick and choose. You know, I had a guy just yesterday say, part-time to me means whenever I have time and want to show up. You know, and usually that's not what they mean. You know, they might mean 30 hours a week, 20 hours a week. You think there's a little disconnect there? Really, really important to clarify that. So what do we really need in terms of the time commitments? And are they always consistent? If you need me 10 hours a week in January, are you still going to need me 10 hours a week in December? Or does it fluctuate at all? Do you see why it's important to clarify this really early on?
Yes.
And I literally had that conversation several times and realized we had the wrong resource. It just was a mismatch. It wasn't going to work. But I'm so glad we had that conversation at the beginning of the team experience as opposed to waiting until we were 5 or 6 months into it. Communication plan. That could be very broad. We want to talk about how we communicate. We want to talk about what's off limits. We want to talk about how often. All of those things are very, very key, particularly in this environment that we're living in now with texting and IMing and emailing. Aren't there some people that you could email them all day long, you're really not going to get a response till you pick up the phone and call them?
Oh, yeah.
Very, very much so. But how do you figure that out? How do you figure out what is each person's preferred communication mode? Ask them. How obvious is that? But how often do we do it? Not often. What do? We just keep emailing. You know, just keep emailing. Because what the research shows is people are going to tend to use the communication mode that they prefer. Okay? They're not going to customize to the other person. And that's where you're going to be more effective. There's some people, I just know they're face-to-face people. I'm going to get so much further if I literally just walk up the stairs, go to the 4th floor, and sit down and talk to her. Haven't you also seen those situations, I call it email volleyball, where it goes back and forth and back and forth. And I'm like, you know, I bet if they would literally just pick up the phone, they could squash this instead of 3 weeks of emails going back and forth. So you want to talk about those things. You also want to talk about what's off limits in terms of email. Have any of you worked in those environments where you've got people sending you the morning blessing, and if you don't forward this to 10 people in 5 minutes, you don't love Jesus? I mean, I just see a variety of different permutations of that. Maybe those things are offline. I worked with another group where they were just really being so inundated with email. They felt like they were so frustrated because they felt that we received so many emails a day. I don't have time to wade through 2 or 3 pages to figure out what you want me to do. Okay? So the new ground rule was anytime you're sending out an email or communication where you really expect the person to take action, you must write action in the subject line and indicate what the action is. And then in the body of the email, you can go into more detail. Because aren't there people who are so lazy, they're not going to open up the email. They're just going to look at the subject. So you really need to catch their eyes and their attention really, really quickly. And so it's this combination. I mean, it's not just slackers, but people are legitimately busy. And so they're wading through hundreds of emails a day. How many of you have also had miscommunications over email or text? Or you read something that wasn't intended, or it sounded like they were yelling because they used all caps. I actually had that with my husband a couple months ago because we text a lot during the day, and sometimes, we send these long texts, and I was really excited about something, so I sent him, this long text, and I was kind of waiting to see what he was going to send back. And first of all, it took like 5 minutes, so that was a problem. Secondly, he sent me back a text and just said, K. And so, of course, I'm like, well, he's got a little attitude. Let me see what's wrong with him. And so I called him up, and I was, really blasting him. And then he was like, well, Dana, I'm driving on 285. I didn't need anything. I just don't have time to text. So again, you're limited, and there's lots of opportunity for miscommunication.
When I traveled a lot, I used to send emails at 1 in the morning because I was sitting in a hotel because I had just arrived. And my team would say, oh my gosh, she wants me to answer this in the middle of the night. She works all these strange hours. And, they started working different hours because of when I sent messages. And we had to come back and set some ground rules around, that's just when I have availability. And you don't have to respond at 1 in the morning. They got that feeling. So
that's really interesting. So, because they were getting the email at 1 a.m., they thought, oh, well, she must expect this.
Yeah. Work all hours, it doesn't matter, 24/7.
Very, very interesting. And I've also seen the other issue where, let's say you go on vacation. I even had a woman in class the other day that she was on her honeymoon. Answering emails. What's the problem with that?
You're training them, you
You
will.
teach people how to treat you. If you don't respect your boundaries, nobody else is going to respect your boundaries. So you have to be so, so careful about that. We talked about ground rules, and then the last thing. What's the last thing we have there? Signatures. Why in the world do we want to do that? Why don't we just kind of talk about it?
The same reason we had a sign.
Exactly for that reason. Do you see how it changes two things? One, the level of commitment jumps up when people have to sign it. Because trust me, we can talk and it'll sound wonderful, and she's kind of nodding her head, and then as soon as I say, oh, okay, well, Ann, can I get you to sign right here? And then she's like, oh, well, let me take it home and get my lawyer to look at it and, look it over. They just take it much more seriously. Secondly, they participate in the conversation differently. I don't spring this on them at the end. I let them know from the outset, hey, we're developing this team charter. I want to be sure it's something that everybody buys into. So part of that process is I want all of us to sign it just to indicate our level of commitment. When they know they're going to have to sign from the beginning, it changes how they interact. So then when I get to team member time commitments and I say, well, I'm going to meet everybody about 20 hours a week. He might say, whoa, wait a minute. I can't quite sign up for that. Versus if there weren't that signature step, he might be much more likely to just kind of sit back and go with the flow, and I don't necessarily get the pushback. Having this team charter is so critical. It's so important to ensure that we're all on the same page, and it provides a context for me to go back to when I do see some slacking behavior or people straying, they're not doing what we signed up for. It's so much easier now, and again, it takes me out of that parent-child dynamic because now I'm just facilitating and I'm supporting what the team came up with. Because who wrote that charter? The team. And that's the only way it's going to work. If you write something out and shove it in front of their face and ask them to sign it, not going to work. You're going to be nailing jello to a tree. Okay? Not going to work. Questions? Comments?
Do you find people are very receptive to that?
Let me throw it out to the group. Do you find people are receptive? I'd say almost half the group said they work with team charters. What's been your experience? A mix. Talk about that a little more.
They're committed because they have a say in it. As time goes on, they have to be reminded.
Oh, yeah.
They forget that commitment.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess overall it's work, but you have to really stay on it and follow it yourself.
You have to role model it because you can't be up there breaking the ground rules. But secondly, I could not agree with you more. Having the conversation, writing it down, is maybe 10% of it. The other 90% is enforcement. I mean, if you come up with ground rules and then you email them out to everybody, nobody ever sees them again. I mean, you might as well not have them. So for me, I have my ground rules very prominently displayed, because if things start falling off and I start seeing dysfunctional behaviors and I'm kind of losing it with the group, I want to literally be able to go up here and touch it and say, hey guys, I'm seeing some PDAs. I know we had a strict rule around no PDAs. We'd agreed that we're going to take technology breaks every 45 minutes. Does that still work for everybody? Is that still a valid ground rule? Do you see how that's an easier way to deal with it than put that away? She told me she was going to tweet, so she's excited.
The whole realization about the 90%. I gotta get that one.
The enforcement is so important. But also to your question, I really, really love your question. Let me just give you a little story from my own personal experience. I do training all the time, and I was talking about team charters probably a few months ago, and I had one person in the group share their experience where they said, we did it, we thought it was working great, we felt great about it, and then at the end, we had one person who wouldn't sign it. Do you think that's useful information to have? Very, very useful. If they won't sign it, that tells you something. I mean, that's certainly data you didn't have before. So that's very, very useful. Any other experiences? Anybody had a particularly positive or negative experience with it? But one of the things I will say just overall is I feel like these are some of the things that I always feel are kind of in the back of our mind that we know we should address, we should talk about, but we're also busy just doing stuff, just executing. We never come back to these fundamentals. And I like the process just because I feel like it kind of forces me to go through these issues with my team and ensure we really are on the same page. The other thing that I like about it is our teams are so dynamic. I mean, I might start out with one team in January, and then I might lose 2 people and gain 3 or 4 new people. It's great to have a document as a starting point for getting people up to speed and talking about it. And to that point, when your team composition changes, what happens to your team charter, do you think? Yeah, it should be revisited and updated. They're not necessarily bound by that. They didn't participate in that commitment process, so we really need to revisit it and see if it still works. It should be a living, dynamic document. It's not like, oh, we did that in May, that's over with. Okay? So constantly revisit.